It's The Spooky Show with Willie.
Greetings, ghouls, and welcome to The Spooky Show. My name is Willie Muse. I'm your host, coming to you from the void of unimaginable horrors. And I'm super excited to bring you guys the first episode of my new show. I don't know where it's going to go, but I do think that things are going to get really good. I think we're about to make some magic here. And you know who else makes magic? I'm not proud of that transition, but it did get my point across because today we're talking about the mother of all monsters, witches. For the record, Dracula's are the father of all monsters, and Frankenstein's are the uncles, but that's beside the point because today we're going to focus on witches. But before we can do that, I should probably take a second to tell you what this show's all about since this is the first episode. Basically, I have always been obsessed with everything spooky and scary, but I've never known much about it other than the fact that I think it's really, really cool. But when I got trapped in this void, I ended up with a lot of free time on my hands. So I decided, hey, why not do a little research and maybe make a cool show out of it? So that's what we're going to do. And with that in mind, let's get to answering the question of the day, which is, where do witches come from? Now, a lot of you are probably saying, witches come from a lot of places. Don't pigeonhole us or put a hex on you. And to you, I say, I completely understand that the word witch means a lot of things to a lot of people, and also don't hex me because I'm fragile. That said, I'm not actually trying to figure out where all witches come from, just the very stereotypical image of a witch that we all have that you kind of see around Halloween. And if you somehow also live in a void and don't know what that is, I'll give you a brief rundown now. The kind of witch I'm interested in is female, and usually an older female. She mixes brews and flies around on broomsticks, and she wears a pointy hat, which, I don't care what anyone says, looks good as hell on me. Well, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this image of a witch. I'm also pretty sure that you've never seen a real one in real life, and that's because, unfortunately, I don't think that kind of witch actually exists. That said, there was a very real monster that led to the creation of the witch myth, and that monster's name was ignorance. Ooh! I don't know why I'm making jokes. People were killed. Moving on. Even the most base level research on witches, which is the kind of research that I did, would tell you that a witch is less a person in a pointy hat and more a person who someone else thought was evil and should be put to death for it. Basically, people like to place blame on other people for their problems, and witches were the perfect target for that. For starters, witchcraft was condemned by the Bible, which back then was literally all the justification you needed to burn someone at the stake. And also, witches were seemingly capable of any sorts of atrocities, so when an atrocity did happen, it was easy to say that a witch did it. You know, you just say, oh, they just used their magic, and that was that. This is all to say that witches were basically just history's scapegoats. They were an easy answer for a lot of really complicated issues that people faced every day. It would be like, I don't know, if we had like a president who, instead of actually trying to fix things, just put all his blame on like immigrants or something. And then instead of like making actual changes, he just kept saying we were going to build a wall, because that would be easier than facing the fact that things are complicated and there are no easy answers. But, you know, thankfully we are much too evolved for something like that to happen anytime. But since they were also an enemy that didn't super duper exist, that kind of complicated things a little bit. But, you know, rather than people accepting the fact that sorcerers weren't real and, you know, like not putting people to death to try and solve their problems, they instead decided to approximate as best they could what they thought sorcerers would be, using people who did actually exist. And this is where you get the concept of a witch hunt. I won't go too deep into it because I think witch hunts deserve their own episode, but I will say that back then witch hunts were a huge deal to the point where the some book I can't really pronounce, Maleficus, Malefica. Let me get my script. Malleus Maleficarum, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, was the second best-selling book for almost 200 years after the Bible. And that was basically just a handbook on how to burn an innocent woman alive at the stake. So, if you're looking for a new read, basically, people were really amped to kill witches, and so they started looking for any reason that they could to justify calling someone out. And this is where that list of traits I showed you earlier comes back into play. So why don't we get that back up, and we'll take it one by one, starting from the obvious, the fact that witches were predominantly women. I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret, and it's going to shock you, but here it is. History was not kind to women. Mind blown, right? It's sad to think about, but the reason that witches are thought of as female is probably because women were the easiest people to blame for being witches. I mean, the way people treated women back then, it wasn't hard to justify saying that one of them was acting out of the norm. I mean, basically all they had to do was like math or think for themselves. Women's lower status in society was also a reason why they were more frequently accused of witchcraft, because people were basically just looking for an easy target, and that's unfortunately where we get the second item of our list, the fact that witches are often depicted as older. And brace yourself, guys, because this is a really, really sad fact. It bummed me out to no end. But basically, the old crone stereotype probably comes from the fact that little old ladies were easier to pick on than like young nubile men. I mean, think about it. If you were going to pick a fight, who would you rather do it with? Hamish Goodbody from the hut next door or his arthritic mother Hagatha? The old crone stereotype probably comes from the fact that witch hunters were picking on little old ladies, and I'm sad now just thinking about it. Of course, sweet little old nanas weren't the only people getting accused of witchcraft, which is where we get the third item of our list, the witch's brew. And this one comes from one of the scariest groups of people you could possibly imagine. Herbalists. Herbalists did exist and they did make brews, so if you didn't super know what was going on back then, it wouldn't be hard to believe that they were engaging in some sort of ritualized magic, particularly if you're amped to kill people to cure all of society's ills. That said, what they were doing was not magical in nature. It was actually closer to science. Herbalists were at that point were probably brewing one or two things. They were either making remedies to heal themselves or intoxicants to get crunk. And strangely enough, the intoxicant part is where we get the next item on our list, the witch's brew. This is my favorite fact I learned in all of my research, and it's super weird and gross, and you'll never look at Quidditch the same way again, so be prepared for that. One of the things that these herbalists were likely making were hallucinogens, and those hallucinogens were probably not the best things to eat, because they would get sick and it probably tastes bad too. That said, they still wanted to get high, so they found other ways, and one of those other ways involved dipping the tip of a broomstick into their mixtures and absorbing the concoction through their skin by shoving the tip of that broom in a place that I shouldn't say out loud. It was their vaginas, and I feel icky saying that. But that was history, and that is where you get the stereotype of the witch riding a broomstick, because that's what they were doing. These hallucinogens would have made you feel like you were floating too, which is probably where we get the fact that the witches are flying on the broomstick, because that's what it would have felt like. Although, since I've never done hallucinogens, I can't say for sure. That said, I did once drink some very expired pineapple juice, and if it's anything like that, things got crazy. I'm almost out of time here, so why don't we just jump ahead to our last item on our list, the pointy hat, which is from another group of unfairly maligned people, the Jews. from Disney movies to Mel Gibson films, all of your favorite things have anti-Semitic undertones, and witches are no exception. Accusing witches essentially involved trying to root out anyone who didn't conform to the Christian ideal, and there was nobody less Christian to these people than Jewish people. As such, over time, witches took on what you might consider stereotypically Semitic features, which is where you get, unfortunately, the big nose that they're often depicted with, and it's also where you get the pointy hat. Back in the 13th century, there was a law that required Jewish people to identify themselves by wearing a specific type of hat, and though it was not exactly what we would think of as a witch's hat, these Juden hats, as they were called, were pointed and probably where this part of the myth comes from. Saying that makes me feel really bad about wearing this, and I would take it off right now if I didn't look so damn good in it. Meh. Before I go today, I just want to take a second to say that everything I said was a very broad explanation of the witch myth, and it was by no means the only explanation of the witch myth. There are a lot of alternate explanations about where our modern perception of a witch comes from. I just am too lazy to get into all of them today, and I'd be here for a while. But that said, if you disagree with me, have a better explanation, please leave it in the comments because I'd love to hear it. And even if it contradicts me, I'm sure it's true. And that's because witches were a lot of things. When we look at the face of a witch today, what we're actually looking at is a mixture of all sorts of different people who society deemed not worthy. The fact of the matter is, had we been born in a different place or time, I, or any one of you watching this video, probably could have been accused of being a witch. And we wouldn't even have had to shove broom drugs up our hootie hoos to do it. I'm Willie Muse. This was The Spooky Show. See you later, ghouls.